We were all taught early in grade school that Columbus discovered America. Is that true? Well, our teacher told us that Columbus discovered America, and when he got here, he met some people and he named them the Indians. You're 5, you're 6, first grade. That's the moment when you started, when you first realized people sometimes lie to you. Because even at that early age, you're already using your critical thinking skills. And you reason that if Columbus was the first guy to get here, but he already met some people who were here, he couldn't have been the first guy to get here. This is a lesson in what we call point of view. You might have heard the old saying, the winners write the history. Well, that's not really true either. Sometimes they do, sometimes the losers write the history. Either way, everything, every event has more than one viewpoint, more than one perspective. And this idea that Columbus discovered America is what we call a Eurocentric point of view, from the point of view of Europeans. And even that's not true, because we know that the Vikings got here about 500 years earlier, but they didn't stay, so they might not count. But clearly, Columbus was not the first human to get here. Now, in chapter 1, I don't expect you to memorize all the names of all these different Indian groups and tribes. What I want you to focus on here is the dynamics, the bigger picture. Focus on the connections, the relationships between these groups, how they interact with each other, how they trade with each other, how they go to war with each other. Pay attention to this, the complexity and the variety of these different Indian civilizations. Focus on the rise and the fall, the rise of one group and then its decline to be replaced with another. And you'll see that this is kind of an ever-changing, very fluid situation. Now, when Columbus and his Eurotrash show up here for the first time in 1492, this was what we call the European discovery of America. And when the Europeans get here, the very first thing Columbus does when he steps off the boat is he meets these people and he says, "Who are you guys?" Because these Native Americans are completely different from any other people the Europeans have ever met. Europeans by 1492, well, certainly are familiar with other Europeans. They're familiar with Africans. They're familiar with Islamic cultures in the Mideast. They're somewhat familiar with Asian cultures due to the Silk Road trade. But they've never encountered anybody like the Native Americans. And so they're trying to figure out, who are these people? And for most of the 1500s and through into the 1600s, okay, participation, taking lots of notes. That's your involvement in the class. Taking lots of notes. Not just on the bullet points when they show up. Taking lots of notes. They come up with a couple of ideas here. One that was pretty popular was that the Indians might be the survivors of the lost continent of Atlantis. That from Greek literature, we get this legend, this myth of a highly advanced civilization known as Atlantis that existed sometime in the hazy past that for some unknown reason simply disappeared. And so Europeans, with this Greek literary tradition, reasoned that, well, maybe some of those Atlantans escaped and made it over here, and these people are their descendants. Okay. Problem is that it might be plausible, but it's not very good explanation because there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence that Atlantis even existed. The Europeans also come up with another idea. Since the Europeans are steeped in this Judeo-Christian tradition, they'll naturally look to the Bible for answers. And there, clearly in the book of Exodus, it talks about the 12 tribes of Israel, and at some point, while they're wandering through the desert, 2 of the tribes get lost, never to be seen again. And so the Europeans might reason that, well, these Native Americans are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Again, makes a good story, no evidence for it. And the only source of evidence that we have is the Bible itself, and you never use one single source. Now, the best explanation that came about early in the 20th century is what we know as the migration theory. This is the most widely accepted explanation of who the Native Americans are. And here we've got solid evidence. But it's not historical evidence. Now, here's one of the problems that we have learning about and understanding the Americas before European contact. The Native Americans didn't have written languages. The Mayans had a writing system, more like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it wasn't a written language. And so they didn't keep records. They didn't write stuff down. So we can't go to an archive and open up Billy Whitehawk's diary from 700 AD and read what he says is going on. Instead, we have to rely on the anthropologists and the archaeologists. And then we historians take this physical evidence that the archaeologists find for us, and we have to then kind of fill in the gaps using logic. And the confirmed data that we have, we got to kind of fill in the gaps. So when it comes to fully understanding the story of pre-Columbian America, or any human civilization prior to about 5000 BC, when the Sumerians first developed writing, there's some good guesses going on here, because we don't have solid written evidence that we can turn to. Now, this migration theory says that the original Americans, the first humans to come to North America, were Asian nomads from the region of Siberia. And these Asian nomadic hunters would follow the big game animals, the woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers. And between about, we'll date this, we think about 40,000 to about 12,000 years ago. So that's a really big window. During this time, we're in an ice age, and much of the Earth's water is held up in glaciers, so much so that the Earth's crust is exposed here in between Asia and Alaska, a place we call Beringia. And so as the animals walked from Asia over into North America, as they were grazing, the humans would follow them. They'd come over here, and then the animals would turn around and go back, and the humans would follow them. And so for a period of probably about 30,000 years, we've got people going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Now, these glaciers extended, well, here, let me get rid of this ink. The glaciers extended to right about, let's say, there. We also have some evidence that, including the land migration, there was a water migration. Fishermen and hunters popping along the ice shelf in small boats like canoes, hunting seals and fishing for salmon, because we've got some archaeological remains down here in Peru where we found boats and fishing equipment. There's also a suggestion, though not proven, that there was a European migration along this ice shelf. There's suggestion, though weak evidence, that there was an African migration as well. The point being, we've got multiple migrations over many, many years. Then, about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 BC, climate change. Global warming that would have Al Gore freaking out. The Earth's climate temperatures rise dramatically over just a couple of centuries, and those glaciers melt, sea levels rise, and as a result, Beringia floods. Now, those nomads that were on the North American side when this global warming begins didn't worry about it. Remember, this takes about 200 years. And so for about 8 generations, it might not have been a big deal. It started getting soggy. And then pretty soon the water was ankle deep. And so you could walk back and forth, but it was really cold water. It's probably pretty uncomfortable. You wouldn't want to do it. And then the next generation later, the water was knee deep. And the generation after that, the water was shoulder deep. You'd die from hypothermia, even going out there for a little bit. So that these nomads that had been caught on the North American side were now trapped. They couldn't go back. The animals that they had hunted were trapped and couldn't go back. So now, the only choice for both the animals and the humans is to move east and south. Now, I had said that we've got good evidence for this. A couple of things here. One, we've got archaeological artifacts, spear points, pottery, a canoe. We've excavated archaeological sites, and so we know that they've built houses and they had campfires. And all of this radiocarbon dates to the exact same period that people are doing these exact same things over in Asia. The other thing that we have are skeletal remains, human remains. Skull sizes, skull shapes, dental types match exactly populations of Asians at that time to populations of Native Americans. That was good evidence, but we still didn't have a smoking gun. It was pretty solid to base this theory. But then, 1990s, early 1990s, we got what's pretty much going to be the smoking gun. DNA. DNA, as we start mapping the human genome, we found genetic markers in these ancient human remains, both in the Americas and in Asia, that are identical from the same time period. So that pretty much, though maybe not exclusively, tells us that the first humans in the Americas were the descendants of Asian nomads. Now, the reason that the European migration is not certain, or an African migration is not certain, is because we don't have DNA samples. that match. We have, from both Europe and Africa, we have some artifacts that date from the same time periods in both continents, but we don't know when those artifacts arrived here. It was almost certainly after 1492. So this is pretty much how we understand things. Now, one of the most recent studies suggests that probably this land migration actually occurred much later, about 2,000 years later than we had previously thought, and that the original folks had been confined to what we today would call Alaska. Because the most recent studies suggest that these mountain valleys that were ice-free didn't have enough plant life to support the animals that the people depended on. And so the animals wouldn't go there because there wasn't enough food. And so until we get 2,000 years into this global climate change, would it be possible for a large-scale land migration? Now again, this is somewhat controversial. The evidence is not conclusive. And it leads to then, well, this is not an open and shut case. But it's the best way that we can understand it so far. Given the evidence that we have, this makes the most sense. Now, contrary to what my brother-in-law would tell you, theory doesn't mean wild-ass guess. Theory means a hypothesis that has consistent, solid data to back up that hypothesis. Now, this migration is going to result in a broad cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is a point of debate in political circles today. But I can tell you from an anthropological and historical point of view that cultural diversity is one of the most basic and oldest features of human civilizations in the New World. And this is due to a couple of things. The anthropologists tell us that by 1492, there are over 2,000 distinct Native American cultures. That's much more diverse than even what you see in Europe at the same time period. Lots of different groups of Indians, and they do things differently. So let's find a common reference point with a definition of culture. Now, when you take your anthropology class, they will give you a more precise and comprehensive definition. But for our purposes, by culture, we simply mean widely shared ways of doing things. Give me an example of culture, a cultural trait or characteristic. Language, the way we communicate with each other, is culturally derived. Good. What else? What? Holidays. The days that we think are more special than other days for whatever reason, right? Music. The way we, kind of entertain ourselves, perhaps. Architecture, the way we build our structures for shelter. Good. What else? The way we organize our political systems. Who has power, who doesn't? The foods that we eat are culturally derived. I mean, until you got a large number of Chinese people here in the U.S., nobody called out for Chinese takeout because that food didn't exist until the Chinese got here. Nobody ate Middle Eastern food like hummus until we get larger numbers of Mediterranean folks in here. Good. What else? Social. What?
How you greet your parents, how you greet people in the
Okay, relationships between different people in the group, your social arrangements. How about one that should be pretty obvious, especially in today's political climate? Clothing. It's not the one I was thinking of at the minute, but you're perfectly right. Clothing. How many of you own a dashiki? A dashiki. One? How many of you have no idea what a dashiki is? We should explain them, right? It's the brightly colored robes and matching hats that are popular in African cultures. Now, do you wear your dashiki very often? No? And then the rest of you, now that you know what they are you going to go get one? They are pretty cool. Probably not, because American culture standards for dress is what? What do we wear? We don't wear dashikis. We wear pants and shirts, blue jeans, t-shirts. I mean, how much more American can you get than blue jeans? We invented blue jeans. Yeah, all of these are, what about religion? The gods that you worship and the way that you worship them. These are all signs of and traits of culture. And no American Indian group did these things exactly like all the other groups did. So we've got 2,000 groups spread across that are doing things different ways. Now, having said that, there are some similarities between these groups. But this diversity can be explained really in two ways. One, through diffusion. And there's two types of diffusion here. There's chronological diffusion, meaning these groups become separated over long periods of time. They lose contact with each other. They don't share ideas anymore because they don't talk to each other. And the second part of this, closely related, the second diffusion factor, is geographical. They become separated by distance. And again, they lose contact with each other. And they forget, maybe, over several generations or 100 generations, what great grandma and grandpa did. They've developed new ways of doing this stuff. The second, and perhaps more important explanation, are environmental factors. The Americas in general, and North America in particular, is a region of very diversified ecological systems, different environmental zones. Back to the map real quick. When everybody was hunter-gatherers, relying primarily on large game animals up here in the Arctic and the subarctic, we all pretty much dressed the same. We ate pretty much the same foods. We used the same tools. The clothing was heavy animal skins. After we killed a woolly mammoth and we ate him, then we took that hide and wrapped ourselves up in it to keep warm. We wore fuzzy boots made out of skins. But now, over a few generations, we have migrated down to Corpus Christi. Do we still wear heavy animal skins? Hell no. Way too hot. Even in summer, we get rid of them. And we wear board shorts and bikinis because the weather allows that. And so as these groups spread out and encounter different environmental zones, they change their ways of doing things. Now, here's the point of debate. Are they forced to change because of these environmental factors, or are they allowed to change? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, that depends totally on your group. If your group makes it down to Corpus Christi and you say, oh my God, this is way too hot, even running around naked, God forbid, you move back up north where it's cold. And so coming down here would be a change that was forced on you that you didn't really like. Or perhaps you like it, it's advantageous. Either way, the environment shapes a number of things that you're going to do here, including, and most importantly, how you feed yourself. Now, this map is not entirely accurate. It's close. But how you feed yourself is one of the main factors in shaping your culture. If you live along the coastal areas, and not just here in the upper northwest, but on any coastal area, you'll probably rely on fishing, such as the remains down in Peru. You'll construct boats. You'll develop fish hooks and fishing nets. On the other hand, if you live someplace where there's good fertile land where you can grow stuff, you might farm. We'll get to that more in a minute. If you live in an area where large game animals like buffalo are easily accessible, widely populated, then you can just hunt. And this concept of hunter-gatherer, that's not a real distinction, because prior to agriculture, all human groups were hunters and gatherers. We humans are omnivores. And when we get hungry, we'll eat just about anything. Even if it's disgusting, we'll eat it to survive. So just because you hunt buffalo most of the time, if you haven't killed any buffalo lately, but here's a great big patch of pumpkins, you're going to chow down on pumpkins. So virtually everybody, some mixture of hunting and gathering. But if you're a hunter, your lifestyle is much different than if you're a farmer. Your culture is different. The way you do your architecture, the way you build your houses are different. If you're in the desert Southwest, Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon, the ancient Pueblans or the Anasazi, you build your homes out of adobe and stone, into the cliffs perhaps. The way you build your ceremonial architecture and the gods, the way you worship. The Adena Hopewell and the Mississippian cultures were known as the mound building cultures. Built these huge earthen shapes, kind of like Stonehenge, that represented something, we don't know exactly what. We think that this was kind of like Stonehenge. The head of the snake is pointed to the spring equinox, and the tail is pointed to the autumn equinox, when the seasons start to change. Here's an example of the communication. The Mississippian culture spread far and wide through the Mississippi River Valley. Now, these are different groups, but they share some things in common. They have basically a common language, and they trade a lot. They communicate. We find stuff that exists only naturally at the Gulf of Mexico up here in the Great Lakes area. And we find stuff that you can only find in the Great Lakes area down here in New Orleans. And so that indicates to us that these groups traded with each other. They moved about. They shared cultural ideas. So we talk in terms also of culture groups, that people living in a relatively close geographic area will share many cultural characteristics, though not specifically all of them. And at the center of the Mississippian culture, of course, was the city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. Population by the time, about 1300, before Columbus gets here at the Mississippian peak, about 25,000 people. That's bigger than any city anywhere else in the world at the time. So this is pretty advanced. Now, another mistake that the Europeans make, not only that they were the first ones to get here, and that Eurocentric point of view implies, and sometimes it's explicit, that if we Europeans didn't do it, then it's not important. Which is, well, rather arrogant. One of the first mistakes that the Europeans make, no matter what Indian group they encounter, is say, you people don't have advanced technology, therefore you are uncivilized. It's called technological determination, if you want the technical name for it. It's an idea that says a society's level of civilization can be measured by how much technology they have. And clearly, in 1492, the Native Americans did not have the level of technology that the Europeans had. And so the Europeans said, hey, you got more simple technology, you're less civilized. Now, is that a good way to actually measure some level of civilization? Let me give you an example. Sometime this afternoon, the Klingons show up. They've clearly got more advanced technology. They can travel through interstellar space. Does that mean the Klingons are more civilized than humans? This means yes. This means no. Right? And in fact, we know, well, until J.J. Abrams got a hold of and ruined the whole storyline, we know, well, even still then, we know that the Klingons are actually pretty rude people most of the time. I'm not sure we could say that they're more civilized than we are. But that's the premise that the Europeans operated on. The Indians, however, did have technology. It wasn't more advanced. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have the harness because they didn't need these items. You develop technology based on your needs. And the technologies, the tools that the Native Americans had developed, basically still Stone Age. They hadn't gotten to Bronze Age, metallurgy. They certainly hadn't gotten to Iron Age. But it was technology, simple by European standards, but adequate, more than adequate for the Native Americans. Their tools not only allowed them to survive, it allowed them to grow and prosper. So they didn't need a wheel. They didn't need a harness. Indian technologies come, well, we group them into three basic ideas. First, are what we call the Clovis and the Folsom technologies, named after the archaeological sites where we found these items. And these are spear points. Clovis points on the left, Folsom points on the right. And it's the Clovis points that match what we find in Asia at the exact same period of time. And the Folsom points are also in Asia, but come from a little bit later period. So this suggests technological advancement. We see this pretty widely spread among hunting groups. This allows you to kill animals easier and faster. Instead of a group of us trying to go isolate a buffalo and wrestling to the ground and break his neck, and in the process probably killing several of us, now with these technologies, these stone spear points attached to a long stick, we can hunt like a pack of wolves. We isolate one buffalo, and then one of us takes a stab at him, and the buffalo turns to defend himself, and then three of us come behind him and stab him, and he turns around, and then another 6 or 8 of us come up from the other side and stab him. Pretty soon he's got 20 or 30 spears stuck in him, and he lays down and dies, and then we eat him. Makes hunting easier, more efficient. Another technology that's common to both hunting and gathering groups are what we call the Plano technologies. These are, and I don't think it has anything to do with Plano, Texas. Mostly cutting and grinding tools, stone shovels to dig up sweet potatoes, stone axes to chop up little rabbits that we trapped, stone knives to skin animals or to cut us off a big piece of buffalo to chew on. Something like a molcajete or a mortar and pestle so that we can find grains like wild corn or wild wheat and pick those seeds and grind them into a powder, add a little water to make a paste, put them on the campfire, let them toast. Ta-da! Tortillas. One of mankind's greatest inventions. And later that afternoon, we invented barbecue. Another technology that's common, especially among agricultural groups, are what we call the desert technologies. And it's not confined to the deserts. What these are carrying or storage technologies. Woven baskets, clay pots, stuff that you can load up like a backpack and carry it with you. Or if you're farming, harvest your stuff. You can't eat it all today. You got to save some of it for later. So you need some way to store your grains or your squash or your potatoes. And so you'll use these technologies. If you're a farmer, you have very little use for spear points. And if you're a hunter, you probably don't have much use for woven baskets or clay pots. They're too heavy to carry around. So different groups use different technologies. That's part of this cultural diversity. Now, here's how we'll do it within class quizzes. When you see a yellow slide, that means it's quiz time. You'll pull out your device, you'll wake it up. I will show you the question. I'll give you a few seconds to glance over the answer choices. And then I'll present it in Top Hat. You'll have 45 seconds to answer. You have permission to collaborate. Talk to each other about this. Figure it out. Discuss the options. The great diversity among Native Americans can partially be explained by red zone, get in. All right, survey says, and the correct answer is, all of these are correct, to explain why the Native Americans are so diverse. Very good. Moving on, we've got to talk a few minutes here about one of the most important things that have ever happened. The agricultural revolution. In our modern, urban, highly technological society, we tend to think, oh, people have always farmed. Farming's old school. Like, it's really old school. Farming is a technological development. It's an adaptation. It's a human adaptation to the environment. And it had the effect of revolutionizing the human condition. This is one of those large-scale things, events, occurrences, that just like the mass extinction of the dinosaurs and the Big Bang itself, or creation if you prefer, changed everything. Nothing's the same afterwards as it was before. So on your list of the most important things that have ever happened, the agricultural revolution needs to be on that list, and it needs to be fairly high on that list. Again, because it changes everything. The practice of intentionally growing food products when and where you want them to grow. Cultivating grains. And raising livestock. Now, the first example that we see of agriculture actually occurs in Israel, modern-day Israel, slightly before it shows up here in the Americas. We'll also see evidence of it developing in modern-day China about the same time. But about 7,000 years BP, meaning before the present, or 5,000 BC, or BCE, we've got the first evidence of humans practicing agriculture, cultivating plants when and where they want. And this occurs in the highlands of central Mexico. So if you want to point to a world leader in human evolution and innovation, look no farther than Mexico, 7,000 years before today, because they were at the forefront of this. Now, one of the things that you have to understand here is that New World agriculture is, in capital letters, plant-only agriculture. Native Americans do not have any domesticated animals like horses and pigs and cows. And so they're not herdsmen. They're not raising livestock. But they get really good at growing a variety of crops that, even when combined with a little bit of meat, provide enough protein to keep your population healthy, and not just healthy, but healthy enough to continue. Now, don't write these down. You probably already could name them anyhow. These are your main plant crops that many of these Indian groups that adopt agriculture cultivate and become dependent on. Maize, or maize for us gringos. Corn. Beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes, pumpkins. Relatively easy to grow given the right conditions, and even smaller amounts of this stuff can be used quite effectively to feed your population. Now, here's the deal with agriculture and with these crops. A couple of things are going to happen. If your group decides to quit hunting and start farming, you have the potential for more food. And when you have more food, you're going to be healthier. And if you're healthier, you're going to live longer. And if you're healthier and live longer, you're going to have more babies. And then your babies will be better nourished, and they'll grow up healthier and stronger, and they'll have more healthy, strong babies, and your population starts to grow. So because of agriculture, if your group adopts it and pulls it off successfully, you have population increase. By the time Columbus gets here, the anthropologists tell us that the population of the Americas is about equal to the population of Europe, about 70 million people. However, that 70 million Native Americans are spread over both North and South America, huge geographic area, while that 70 million in Europe are crammed into something about this big right here. All of Europe would fit in what in 1861 was considered the Confederate States, the 11 lower South states. So it's a kind of tiny place. Now, when you're doing this, you got to make a choice. Risk or benefit? Now, the standard way to understand this had always been, oh, agriculture, was a mark of civilization. That once people quit hunting and quit wandering, being nomads, once they settled down in one place and practiced sedentary agriculture, they were on their way to civilization. Again, that's a Eurocentric point of view, because that's how the Europeans did it. But we started asking some different questions. We'd always assumed that as soon as people figured it out, they'd go to agriculture. But now we understand this a little bit differently in terms of, well, kind of like a business major would. It's a risk versus benefits decision. Your group has to make a choice. Do we want to keep hunting and live our nomadic lifestyle, or do we want to settle down, stay in one place, and practice farming? What are the risks? Well, the risks, think about it. You decide to stay in one place, grow crops. What could go wrong here? Crop failure. For what reasons? Drought. Your crops don't come in, your people starve. That wouldn't be good. Plant diseases, wildfires, anything, floods that could destroy your crop that year, you're going to be in pretty bad shape. On the other hand, had you remained hunters, you might go a week or two without killing an animal, and you might start getting hungry, but pretty soon you're going to kill an animal and be able to eat. What would be the benefits? Well, you stay in one place, you pull this off properly, everything goes the way you want it to, more food, so now everybody's fat and happy, and you have more babies, and your babies are fat and happy. Food not only can feed yourself, it can be a very valuable trade item, as in the Mississippian culture. Stuff that we grow here, we can trade with for items that we can't grow, other things that we want that other people have. And so it's a form of wealth. It's something that we can trade. It could also be used as a weapon. We have a huge surplus this year, but there's a couple of other groups around us whose crops failed. And they come to us and they beg us, please share your food with us. And we say, sure, but you have to give us your consent that we rule you, that we're going to dominate you, and you'll pay taxes to us, things like that, in exchange for this food. So it's not only, well, a commercial item, it's a diplomatic, a military item. Your group has to decide which would be best for you. Is it too great of a risk? Do the benefits outweigh the risks? And even then, it could be uncertain, at least in the early years. Some groups never adopt agriculture, like the Sioux and the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche. A variety of groups on the Great Plains never adopt agriculture because they had plenty of buffalo. They could continue their nomadic hunting ways, and they had decided that's what's best for them. Now, if you adopt agriculture, you're going to have to change the way you organize your society. And this again contributes to that cultural diversity. The way you used to do things, the way great-grandma and great-grandpa did things when they were hunters or hunter-gatherers, don't really work anymore. See, when we were hunters, it took our entire group. And these hunting groups, the bands of hunters were anywhere from, I don't know, maybe 50 to 75, 80 people. usually all related somehow. And it took the labor, the efforts of all of us to hunt. Today we say men hunt and women gather. Yeah, no. There's no gender-based division of labor here. Whoever was available and could do it went out and did it. And it took all of us to hunt so that we could find enough food to sustain ourselves. Now, though, when we start practicing agriculture, we don't need as many farmers. All of you guys here in the first 2 rows, farming, you all can produce enough food to feed the rest of us. That leaves the rest of us free to do something else. And so we're going to need to reorganize our societies here. We're going to have to not only adapt, we're going to have to adopt some new ways of thinking. One will be in the division of labor, as we just mentioned. Since it takes fewer people in our group to produce enough food to feed the rest of us are now free to pursue other activities. We can pursue diplomacy. Some of us get really good at negotiating with other groups. Some of us who are the biggest and the strongest become the warrior class. Some of us who are good at making deals, like our incoming president, are the merchants. And some people who are creative become our artists. And people who seem to understand the relationship between man and nature become our religious leaders. And then we have a political class that starts to develop, that makes the rules that the rest of us follow. And so we've got this division of labor that starts to emerge. And this division of labor is going to lead to a hierarchical social structure. And both of these, the social reorganization upon the adoption of agriculture, is very similar, not just among Native American groups, but among all human populations that adopt agriculture. We're going to get a hierarchy of status and authority and wealth based on what your group identifies as being the most valuable contributions. And most societies follow a similar pattern. Again, don't write this down. You could have told me. At the top of the hierarchy, those who accumulate the most wealth and the most power are our political leaders, the chieftains. And below them would be the priests that have the power to shape our religious ideas and explain the natural world. And then the merchants, maybe, who are good at making deals to get the stuff that we want. The warrior class has high status because they're the ones that protect us and go out and conquer other people. The artisans that make things like clay pots and stone shovels and stone hoes. The farmers that actually use these tools to grow the food. And we've got some common laborers. And then at the bottom of every society throughout human history have been the disposable people, the slaves. Now, in the American tradition, the Eurocentric American tradition, slavery became defined as being of African descent. But all human populations, even the Africans, practiced some form of slavery at some point in their development, as did the Native Americans. The status of being a slave, though, is not necessarily the same throughout these different civilizations. But the Native Americans had slaves. The people that did the dirtiest, hardest work, that had the lowest status. And so you get then a much more complex society. And again, not all groups adopt agriculture and go through this process of social reorganization. Not all of these groups develop these highly sophisticated technologies and these highly sophisticated civilizations like the Aztec or the Mayan. But those that do very closely resemble European social structures, which the Europeans tend to overlook. But in many ways, they're more similar than different. Sorry. Didn't talk about this one, not gonna quiz you on it. The Three Sisters are a funk fusion group, the Motown sound of the 60s. No. Corn, beans, and squash, the three most important agricultural products that all agricultural groups used. We're not taking quizzes, put the cell phones down. These are the three basic foods, the most important food crops, that these provide enough protein that even when combined with even tiny amounts of meat, or in some cases no meat at all, provides enough protein to maintain a healthy population. We've got a couple of myths here that we need to bust real quick. A lot of myths about the Native Americans, starting with, and perhaps, Columbus discovered America. And again, these myths develop as a result of misperceptions and misconceptions on the part of Europeans about who the Native Americans are. One of the myths that carries over probably even through today, I've heard it, is that the Native Americans were our first environmentalists. They were the first to go green. They were green before green was cool. I call it the Kevin Costner, the Dances with Wolves myth. This idea that the Native Americans never harmed nature. They never did anything to disturb the environment, that they worshiped the environment. Well, they did. They had a different understanding, the relationship between man and nature, than the Europeans did. Again, from their Judeo-Christian heritage, in the Bible, it says that God gave man dominion or control of the earth and its resources. And so man is above nature in this Eurocentric view. From a Paleo-Indian point of view, though, man is part of nature, not dominant, not superior, but simply a part of a larger interactive web of relationships between people, plants, animals, the earth. And the Native Americans frequently damaged the environment. You decide to farm. How do you farm without chainsaws to cut down the trees and bulldozers to dig up the tree stumps to make a nice field? Well, you start a forest fire and burn all the trees down to clear the land so that you can start farming now. Some of the hunters, before they got horses, would frequently start prairie fires. And a herd of buffalo would run, fall down this 100-foot cliff, and 1,000 buffalo would die. And then 100 Indians would come down and skin 2 or 3 animals, and the rest would be left to rot. That's pretty wasteful. They would dam rivers and alter the course of these rivers, which would disturb the natural ecology. So they frequently damaged the environment. They certainly altered the environment when they started practicing agriculture. So they weren't really our first environmentalists, but they did have a smaller carbon footprint, as we call it today. They had a smaller impact on nature, on the environment, than the Europeans did, who practiced a much more intensive style of agriculture, and certainly less than we do today. Another myth is that before those nasty Europeans got here, all of the Indians lived a happy, peaceful coexistence. They all sat around the campfire at night holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and passing the peace pipe around. And everything was mellow, and everybody was happy, and they all got along. But then those nasty Europeans got here and introduced things like bloodshed and warfare and jealousy and hatred and strife and chaos. As Henkin clearly explains, the Americas were a violent place long before the Europeans got here. Make no mistake about this. Indians killed other Indians. And they did so for the exact same reason that Europeans killed other Europeans and that Africans killed other Africans: for wealth, for power, for revenge. The same human emotions and the same motivations are at work in these Native American populations. And there's two things that they fight over. One is resources. We have this idea that the Indians didn't believe in owning land. Well, yes, they did. Only, unlike the Europeans, who believed individuals could own specific plots of land, the Native Americans had a more communal concept of ownership. This room belongs to us. And if Professor Peterson's group tries to come in here on Tuesday, Thursday mornings at 9 o'clock and take our resources, by God, we're going to stand up and resist that. We're not going to let them take our stuff. Through warfare, simply through trying to dominate other groups. You think this other group's got stuff that you want, they won't trade it, they won't give it to you, so you put together your warriors and you go out and you conquer them. And then you rule them. And so these various factors here are at work long before the Europeans get here. And this myth of cultural homogeneity, I think we've pretty well blown this myth already. What does homogeneity mean? Sameness. Instead, we have cultural diversity or heterogeny. That there is no such thing as a single Native American culture any more than there's a single African culture or a single European culture. The last one concerns religion. And here the Europeans, again, huge misconception. They come over here with their Judeo-Christian ideas and they say, you Indians have no religion. Where's your churches? Where's your Bibles? Where's your crosses? You people have no religion. You're heathens. You're savages. You're uncivilized. Well, Native Americans had religion, just different styles. There's one group known as the hunting tradition. If your group depends primarily on hunting to live, you'll probably fall into this group. Here, your deities are the spirits of the animals that you hunt, that you depend on. And so you'll develop these elaborate ceremonies to appease these animal spirits, to honor these animal spirits. And here you get the spirit of the bear, the spirit of the wolf. On the other hand, if your group farms, you really don't have much use for the spirit of the bear or the spirit of the wolf. Instead, you're part of what we call the agrarian or agricultural tradition. And here, your deities, your gods, are the forces of nature. The sun god, the wind god, the rain god, Mother Earth, and Sky Father. The forces of nature that you depend on to make sure that your crops grow when and where you need them. And we've got a couple of different belief systems then between the Europeans and the Native Americans. But we'll leave it here for just now. I'm going to turn it over to Eugene. We're going to pass out these SI surveys, fill them out, starting at the back, just start tossing them out. Put down reasonable times that you would be most likely to go to SI. Once you're done filling it out, bring it to Eugene, bring it to me. What's your name?
I don't remember.
Neither do I. Give me a stack.
Yes, sir.
Pass some around up here. A couple there. Give you a bunch there. Pass those on down.